Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at the weaknesses of supply-side policy. So we touch on the strength, including their ability to target particular sectors, target all the goals at a particular point in time, the fact that there's a less conflict with supply-side policies. Now we're going to look at some of the weaknesses. So the first one will be that supply-side policies have long implementation and long impact lags. So while budgetary has long implementation lags and monetary potentially has long impact lags, supply-side policies have both. It can take some time for policies to be implemented. So often, major infrastructure projects, for example, take a long time to get passed. Sometimes they can have negative impacts on certain people who can lose their home. Different groups will protest against them for various reasons, including environmental concerns. So the legislative process can be really long. If there are supply-side policies that are going to hurt equity, so labour market reforms and things like that, they can take months and months and even years to get through Parliament. Others, like infrastructure projects, also take a long time. So first of all, they have long implementation lags, and secondly, it can take a number of years for them to have their full impact or their full benefit on the economy. So if you look at something like education, we implement an education policy. In terms of its benefit for supply-side potential, it can take a long time before we see the fruits of that education spending, particularly if it's involved with improving education at a primary level. In terms of actually output and boosting our productivity, well, those students aren't going to work for 10 years probably. So it can take a long time to have its full impact on the economy. Infrastructure spending, as you know, takes a lot of time before it can have its full benefit on the economy. It needs to be built. So the stabilisation role, its ability to get rid of peaks and troughs or remove peaks and troughs, is very limited and pretty much non-existent. It's the demand policies that are more likely to be used for peaks and troughs. Supply-side policies are very unuseful in terms of having a stabilisation role in the economy because they have both a long impact and a long implementation lag. Political constraints, another problem is that political constraints often inhibit the implementation of impact of some aggregate supply policies. Often they're politically unpopular, so microeconomic reform policies like trade liberalisation, like labour market reforms, can often hurt or harm certain people within society. So it can have a lot of political constraints and take a long time for them to, the implementation may get a long time to get through Parliament. There are a lot of loopholes you need to jump through before they can actually take place. So trade liberalisation benefits the economy as a whole, but it can hurt particular sectors. So removing tariffs for things like manufacturing can often have political constraints attached to them because they're unpopular in certain sectors. Market-based interventionist policies can hurt equity. So another problem is that many policies designed to boost efficiency, like microeconomic reform policies, labour market deregulation, removing unfair dismissal laws, tying wages to productivity, they can lead to much higher levels of income inequality, which can lead to unskilled workers with limited bargaining power, often having a wage below the poverty line. So in Australia, if you earn less than 50% of the average income, you're considered to be below the poverty line. Many of these market-based policies can often lead to more people living below the poverty line. So, for example, in recent budgets, we've talked about reforms to the welfare system. So we've talked about trying to make it hard for those on drugs, the 3 strikes policy. All of these things are designed to promote efficiency, but they can hurt some of the more vulnerable members of society. They can be seen as unfair, and they can be seen to targeting those who are already vulnerable members of society. So another problem, along with the implementation and impact lag and the political constraints, is that they can often hurt equity in society. There's transitional costs associated with some of them, so they can have some negative impacts on structural unemployment and business bankruptcy in the short term. If we look at immigration, for example, immigration can lead to more structural unemployment because it can lead to more competition for jobs. So there are transitional costs before we reach some of the benefits from some of these policies. Another problem is that there's overseas constraints. So sometimes for the supply-side policies to have their true benefit, it relies on goodwill and cooperation from other countries. So if you look at trade liberalisation, for example, in order for that to be fully effective, we need the other countries to sign the free trade agreement and therefore agree to reducing some of these protectionist measures. So trade liberalisation, for example, is more effective if the other country also helps to reduce their protection on their imports, because then Australian exports will become more competitive and then we'll have its full benefit for growth and jobs as we specialise in areas of comparative advantage. So there's also overseas constraints and transitional costs associated with supply-side policies. Some aggregate supply policies hurt long-term growth. So, for example, if we're providing subsidies for businesses that are potentially unproductive or are not as competitive or have comparative disadvantage, there may be short-term benefits for employment because they've been protected and they've lowered their cost of production, which makes them more competitive. But in the long term, they may have costs for jobs and growth if it reduces efficiency, and there's that idea of that self-defeating strategy associated with some subsidies if it reduces productiveness. It should be less of an issue of concern today because there's less protection of subsidies in place. The last problem, and this is probably one that less of you will be talking about, but it can also crowd out the private sector. So what I mean by that is if some interventionist policies involve lowering taxes or spending more money, so it might be company tax cuts, income tax cuts, research and development tax concessions, or infrastructure spending, they all increase the size of the budget deficit because they're all about either reducing revenue or increasing expenditure. That can lead to more government borrowing because when the government runs a deficit, they're spending more than they're earning, and that can lead to the government being forced to borrow money from overseas. And then increased borrowing can lead to higher interest rates because the government needs to borrow from the private sector, the idea of crowding out, which then leads to less liquidity for the banks, higher interest rates, and crowding out of the private or the external sector, as there may be more capital inflow associated with either higher interest rates or we may borrow from overseas, which would also lead to capital inflow. So some supply-side policies can lead to crowding out of the private sector, which can lead to a less efficient allocation of resources and can potentially hurt growth because of higher interest rates. Thank you.